Hello and welcome to the Gnostic Warrior radio show and podcast, broadcasting from GnosticWarrior.com in San Diego, California, to around the world. I'm your host, Mo, and today on the show we have alternative researcher, historian, and professional writer of over 30 years, Alan Butler. Alan is the author and co-author of several books, and in this episode we're going to talk about his solo book, Washington, D.C., the City of the Goddess. Everywhere you go in Washington, D.C., you will see statues of the goddess of one sort or another. Alan tells us what is so strange about these goddess statues and what role Freemasons had in designing and building Washington, D.C. He also talks about the Pentagon and the crucial importance to Freemasonic belief and ritual, but it has been recognized as the heart of every Pentagon is the pentagram, the same five-pointed star that is also important in Freemasonry. This is a great episode where Alan details much of the history behind the building of the Capitol and also the history of the goddess. Alan lives with his wife in the northeast of England, and when not at his beloved desk writing and traveling the world, he is filming regularly for the History Channel, H2, Discovery, and BBC, amongst others. This is really an awesome podcast, so please stay tuned for Washington, D.C., the City of the Goddess. Thanks for being on the show today, Alan. How you doing?
I'm absolutely fine, thanks, Mo. It's a beautiful day here in Great Britain, and I'm wearing a t-shirt and shorts.
Great. And before we get into the great work that you're doing now with all your books and the subject we're going to talk about today, the City of the Goddess, can you please tell us about who you are and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, no problem. I was born and bred here in the north of Great Britain. I started out my original career as an engineer, but ever since I was a child, I've always had a great sense of mystery about the world and about things that are going on around us. And I've always written ever since I was really tiny. So eventually it seemed to be right to spend more time writing and less time engineering. So for the last 30 years or so, I've been a professional writer. My major interests when I started out lay with ancient European history, particularly what's known as megalithic history, to do with stone circles like Stonehenge and Avebury, with ancient measuring systems, and also with ancient astronomy. But these subjects have led me on to associated and then even different subjects. I've written over the years about 23 books, and I cooperate an awful lot with people like you, and also I do a lot of filming with both British and American networks, and tend to travel the world quite a lot at the moment. So I've got a range of interests, but ancient history is still foremost amongst them.
So you started out studying the megalithic structures and the stone structures around the world, and then that led you, of course, sometimes we say down the rabbit hole in studying, the mythologies, the gods and the goddess of these same people as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's true, Mo, but it's also fair to say that mythology was always something of an interest. One of the very first books that my parents got me that I really liked was a book on Greek mythology, so in a way that's always been there too, and to me, the two subjects go hand in hand. It's the not knowing what these people were thinking and what their means of worship was that really made me want to connect the two together. So I suppose you could call me something of an anthropologist, because it's as much the history of people as the history of things which really fascinates me.
I agree. And what do you feel is this fascination or this thing that we're drawn to, people such as yourself, Alan, and other people that you're working with, people that are into alternative history, Greek mythology, art? What draws us to this? What do you feel? Have you ever asked yourself this question?
I have. I think to start with, there's a natural inclination. We are by nature a very inquisitive species, and mysteries tend to be of interest to most of us in one way or another. But I think when you start to get into these things, you begin to realize that there's a lot of silence in the world from so-called experts, about things that maybe they should either know more about or should be telling us more about. And being an ornery sort of person, I think I decided quite early on that if they weren't going to tell me, I was going to find these things out for myself.
Is this a massive conspiracy from the top down towards academia and orthodox historians to basically keep our history suppressed where this alternative research doesn't get out there, so we plebs, us citizens, us pawns, whatever you want to call us, we're more easily controlled because they control our past and we kind of forget who we are when we're reincarnated into the society?
This is something that I've thought about a great deal, and the conclusions I've come to really don't push me personally in the direction of feeling that there is a cohesive strategy from above to keep us in the dark. I think a lot of it is to do with the way people are made. You know, experts in any particular field these days, unlike 100 or 200 years ago, are absolute specialists. They know their own field, but they don't know a great deal outside of it. Also, they tend to be employed by organizations which are quite conservative in their inclinations. It's difficult for people to walk outside of orthodoxy when their research grants, their professorships, or whatever it may be, relies upon them towing the party line. So whilst we'll go on perhaps to talk about the possibility of some sort of conspiracy from above, I think in the main, at a personal level, it's really just the way people are. If a professor of astronomy, for example, walks outside his box and agrees with me when I say something about the moon or one of the other planets that's not orthodox, he's probably risking his job, and he's certainly risking his credibility. I think that's the main motivating force.
It reminds me of that quote by Shakespeare, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They all have their exits and their entrances." Is this how the world truly works? We all have our free will to choose our parts, whether that be in academia or alternative research?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, though. And I think it's even more correct now than it was when Shakespeare wrote the line. Mm-hmm. Because when you go back to Shakespeare's times, you tended to get people who were clever across the board, people like Isaac Newton, people like Leonardo da Vinci. They could look in lots of different directions. Newton in particular, for example, is very famous because he's called the father of science. But what scientists themselves tend to ignore is that he spent far more of his life writing things about astronomy and alchemy than he ever did about science. Science were periphery to his interests. Now we're living in a world of specialization, and we don't often tend to wander outside the box. I think it's people like me that still try to do that, and it's not always easy because obviously we're treading on other people's toes as far as they're concerned.
I agree, Alan, and you've written many books that do just that. And before we get into your current book we're going to talk about today called Washington, D.C., the City of the Goddess, can you inform the audience a little bit about your other books and work?
I can. The whole business with City of the Goddess started out with a book I wrote with a guy called Christopher Knight, who's another English researcher and writer, and that book was called Civilization 1. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. We also wrote a book on Freemasonry called Solomon's Power Brokers. The book that actually directly led to Washington, D.C. was a book called Before the Pyramids, and again that was written with Christopher Knight. And then I went on to write City of the Goddess myself. In the meantime, I've written other books particularly about the goddess. The Goddess of Grail and the Lodge is the one that immediately springs to mind, which has been a good seller over the years and which people still write to me about, and other books on Freemasonry, and also books on a strange little place in Scotland called Rosslyn Chapel. I've written 2 books on that. So a fair range of books, but nearly all dealing either with ancient history or with medieval history. I've even written a book called Sheep, which is, as the title says, is about sheep. So I do all sorts of things.
It would really be great to have you on in the future and talk about some of those other books, but I know our time is limited, and today in this podcast we're going to talk about your book, Washington, D.C., the City of the Goddess. Can you educate the audience a little bit about the book and what inspired you to write it?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the inspiration first because the one leads to the other. When Chris Knight and I wrote the book Civilization 1, what we were trying to do was to work out the origins of a particular unit of linear measurement which were used by the people who built monuments such as Stonehenge, Avebury, and all the other standing stones and henges. This unit is called the Megalithic Yard, and it was rediscovered by a professor of engineering from Oxford University called Alexander Thom. It was something that he spent all his spare time measuring these structures, some of which go back to as long ago as 4000 BC. And he got loads and loads of figures together because he was a mathematician and an engineer and a statistician. And out of all his figures fell this unit of measurement, which he called the Megalithic Yard. In modern terms, it's 2.22 feet in length. Sorry, 2.722 feet in length. And if you've got any metric listeners, that's 82.966 centimeters. All the people who were archaeologists and who looked at these things, on the one hand, they applauded Alexander Thom, who is known as the father of astroarchaeology, because he was the first one to suggest that these structures were built primarily to study the sky. But on the other hand, they repudiated his findings over the Megalithic Yard because they said there's no way people all those years ago could possibly have had a uniform unit of measurement and had passed it on across the best part of 2,000 or 3,000 years, and that it remained totally the same. So Chris and I, we thought this vilification of Alexander Thom was unfair. So we decided to find out what the Megalithic Yard was, whether it really existed, and how they had passed it on. And in a very short explanation, we discovered that the Megalithic Yard was defined anywhere where it was needed. It wasn't passed on like somebody passing on a foot ruler or a yard measure. It was decided by the use of a pendulum, a simple pendulum, and the movements of the planet Venus across a certain part of the sky. And it works absolutely perfectly wherever you do it. So we knew that we'd found, what the Megalithic Yard was and how they'd defined it, and probably would have left it at that, except for the fact that we also discovered that the Megalithic Yard is much more than just a measurement. It's part of a much bigger holistic measuring system which measures time and space and volume and mass, and it's also based on a really, really ancient form of geometry which hasn't been used ostensibly since 2000 BC. This geometry, I'll just tell you what's really different about it, is that instead of having 360 degrees to a circle, it has 366 degrees to a circle. That became important to us when we started to measure all the megalithic monuments afresh, and we discovered that there was a unit of 366 megalithic yards, which crops up time and again, certainly all over the British Isles and also across parts of France. Now, what led us further still was that by almost chance, we found this measurement being used in a city in the south of England called Bath. And we discovered that this unit had been used to create a structure that looked like a modern version of Stonehenge. It's called King's Circus, and it was built in the 1700s by a man called John Wood. John Wood was quite a remarkable man. He was very interested in all sorts of subjects. But what really made him stand out was that he seems to have been a very early Freemason. Once we discovered that this series of 366 megalithic yards had resurfaced in the 1700s in Bath, we wanted to find out if it had turned up anywhere else in the world at a similar time. Now, Bath was kind of a new city at the time, so there was lots of new building going up at that time. But there are very few cities in the world that were effectively built to plan and built during that period. But there was one city that most definitely was, and we knew that that city also had a great deal to do with Freemasonry, and that, of course, was Washington, D.C. in the United States. So we turned our attention, with the help of Google Earth and maps and so forth, to measuring Washington, D.C. as accurately as we could. And within an hour, we were starting to find many, many examples of this 366 megalithic yards, which comes out about 996 feet. They are all over the place, but they're below the surface in Washington, D.C. They form another map, and they all seem to spread out, most of them anyway, spread out from the center of a structure which is south of the White House, which many American listeners will have been to. It's called the Ellipse, and it's a huge park, and it's just south of the White House gardens. It is from the very center of this park, which was built just after the American Civil War, that most of these measurements of 366 megalithic yards originate. And it was that first drew my personal attention to Washington, D.C. Once we had mapped all of those measurements, then we completed our book before the pyramids. And then I wanted to go further. Chris was busy doing other things. And that's when I decided to write Washington, D.C., City of the Goddess, because there are religious overtones to all of this. It isn't just measurements. And wherever we find these measurements, basically we find aspects of goddess worship.
That is just amazing. From thousands of miles away, you were able to use technology to figure out these measurements, basically remote view from over the pond using this technology. It's just simply amazing.
That is so true, Mo, and I think it's a testimony to the kind of information that is at our fingertips these days, that this was possible. And I'm not sure that in a previous age we would even have gone to the trouble of looking, because it would have been so much harder to do. We would have had to get the relevant maps, which would have been difficult, and for all sorts of reasons. It may not have come to light, but it was primarily, in the first instance, of course we checked everything very carefully, but it was primarily due to the existence of Google Earth with its very accurate measuring system.
You had mentioned that park in Washington, D.C. Would that park happen to be set up near the Lincoln Memorial?
Yes, it's generally close. Washington, D.C. was originally designed to be a right-angled triangle. For those people who know the city, if we take a line directly south from the White House, we come to what's known as the Mall, which is a very long area of green which leads from the Capitol building at one end to the Lincoln Memorial at the far end.
Okay.
So as far as this triangle is concerned, the guy who created Washington, D.C. was a guy called Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. He was a Frenchman, but he was one of George Washington's aides during the War of Independence, but he was also an artist and an architect. He designed the city around this right-angled triangle. The back line of the triangle ran from the White House to a position on the Mall, where the Washington Memorial was supposed to eventually stand. It ran east of that, along the Mall, to the Capitol building, and then the hypotenuse of the triangle ran from the Capitol up to the White House. And everything else in Washington, D.C. Was based upon that triangle.
The reason I ask you, Alan, is because I had visited Washington, D.C., I'd say about 6 years ago, and I had an incredible experience, almost out-of-body experience at one of these locations, just about where you're talking about on the back.
Where were you, Mo?
A friend was giving me a tour of Washington, D.C., and he'd take me to the Lincoln Memorial and walked me around back, and this is where I had this experience. And I remember looking across, I believe it was the state capitol at the time, and all of a sudden this vibration started taking over my body, and I felt this complete euphoric feeling, almost like I was out of body for about 5 minutes, and I never really could explain it. And this was before I got into alternative research and Gnosticism and so forth.
I can't say that I'm at all surprised about that, because I've had many similar experiences myself in the center of D.C.
Oh, wow.
Where you were standing is a very potent location. Washington, D.C. is very much more than just a series of buildings. It was designed as, the best way you could describe it, as a huge temple. The whole of the center of Washington, D.C. is part of the same temple. It's on an east-west axis. And where you were standing at the Lincoln Memorial, if you were looking at the Capitol building, then were you to be there on June the 21st or September the 21st, which are known as the equinox days, you would have seen the sun rise clear over the statue of the goddess of freedom on top of the Capitol. This is a very, very special place, and sensitive people, which you obviously are, tend to feel this almost instinctively.
I felt that energy the entire time I was in Washington, D.C., but I know for a fact, Alan, that I was there in June. So
yeah, well, there you are. You see, any time around that time, I mean, there is so much about Washington, D.C., which is incredible, and that people don't even begin to suspect. Maybe if we've got time, we can talk about what happens with the Washington Monument, because that in itself is utterly incredible. But the whole place was built to be sacred, and so it's not surprising that it feels sacred.
Most definitely a sacred place. I agree, Alan. What role do the Freemasons have in designing and building the nation's capital?
Here becomes something of a problem. There is no doubt whatsoever that many Freemasons were involved in the planning and building of Washington, D.C. Two of the most famous ones were George Washington himself, who was a Freemason, and also the third president, Thomas Jefferson, who was a Freemason, and both of them had a great input on the city. The guy who actually designed the city, this Pierre Charles L'Enfant, he was also a Freemason. So there's three right at the center of what was going on, and there were many more behind the scenes. But it has to be said that I've never been absolutely certain, and still I'm not certain, that what we are looking at is necessarily just Freemasonry. It's almost as if, and we might as well say this right at the start of the conversation, it's almost as if there is another body which takes some of its recruits from Freemasonry, and probably from other organizations like the Rosicrucians, and back in history from organizations like the Knights Templar, which is related to all of them, but which is not the same as them. So Freemasons did have a lot to do with the building of Washington, D.C., but whether that's because they were Freemasons or whether they were Freemasons because they were also something else is probably more to the point.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me that no one seems to bring up is that, America was founded by various countries, basically. You have Washington. I'm not sure which country he had come to. Then you have this French.
He was ultimately British.
Okay, he was British. So you have a British Washington, and then you have Frenchmen as well. It almost seems like the goal with America was a multinational formed country by various countries that had a hand in building it. Oh,
I don't think there's any doubt about that whatsoever. I think that was a deliberate thing right from the start. I think they wanted as big a eclectic mix as they possibly could. I mean, what they were trying to do at heart was to build the New Jerusalem. They were trying to build a utopia, a heaven on earth, if you like. And they wanted as many different people as possible to be involved.
This other organization that you had mentioned that might quite possibly be pulling from the ranks of these secret societies, would that happen to be the Jesuits or possibly the Vatican?
No, I don't think it is.
Okay.
But I think it quite likely that the Jesuits have been involved at times. I think that the actual organization itself has been and remains more or less invisible. Nobody's looked harder for it than I have, but I haven't found it in the Vatican, though I have found Jesuits associated with it. Just let me give you one example. On 3 or 4 occasions, and some of those occasions when my wife was with me to testify that this is what happened, if I'd been at a seminar or talking somewhere else in the world, then at the end, when things went quiet and I'd taken all the questions, then a guy would come up to me, a different guy each time, always sort of early middle-aged guy, always well-dressed, tall, and he would say to me on each occasion, "My name is Michael, I'm an ex-Jesuit priest, and I just want you to know that you've got to keep searching because you're going in the right direction." But they never said that they were a Jesuit priest. They only ever said they were an ex-Jesuit priest. So again, I think like with the Freemasons and with other groups, the people that we are talking about remain generally invisible, but they draw their resources from lots of other organizations.
It's interesting. I always thought that the main top organization, if there was one, that they were essentially good people, the grand architects, and they use, of course, through the ranks of these secret societies, through government and so forth, via free will, they would pull from these ranks. So it's really interesting. And everywhere you go in Washington, D.C., you'll find statues of the goddess of one sort or another. What's so strange about the goddess statues?
This stands at the heart of everything, I think. We need to go back maybe 6,000 years to all of Europe and most of Asia, at which time religion was very different than it became subsequently. We know from archaeological finds there was a supreme goddess being worshipped at that time, and she seems to have been synonymous with the earth. Now, when farming came along and circumstances changed and other peoples came into Europe from the Far East, or the Far East of Europe rather, things started to change a bit, and particularly with farming, then male gods started to become dominant, and the one overriding goddess dropped into the background. She did survive in certain places, and the best example of that is the island of Crete in the Mediterranean, where there was a civilization called the Minoans. Well, we call them the Minoans. They existed until, probably about 1450 BC, and even after in some ways. And it's from then that we can draw a good understanding of what megalithic religion was all about. And it's centered on this goddess. And the one thing that I began to learn as I went on and on through my research was that wherever the measurements were present, this megalithic yard and the 366 megalithic yard, there's always strong evidence of the presence of the goddess as well. And that was one of the things that came immediately to mind when I was walking around Washington, D.C., both when I was walking around on my own and with friends, or even when I was filming there to do documentaries on other subjects. Everywhere I looked, there were statues of the goddess. At first, I told myself that that's understandable because the style of architecture which was employed when Washington, D.C. was being built was known as classical architecture. It kind of referred back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And of course, these people were very fond of statues. So if you're going to replicate the architecture, you're probably going to replicate the statues as well. But the problem in Washington, D.C. is that it's out of all proportion. There is barely an intersection, barely what we would call a roundabout country, which doesn't have some kind of goddess symbolism associated with it. And of course, next to the Washington Monument, the highest thing in Washington, D.C. is the statue on top of the Capitol building, which is the goddess of armed freedom. But the Americans have and had for a long time their own goddess. She developed from a Latin goddess called Libertas, and so it's not surprising that the word liberty is actually the name of a goddess. She was the goddess of freed slaves, so she was very, very relevant to those people who fought in the First War, when your country and mine had that small misunderstanding. And what they wanted was to be free from the domination of Britain. So it was quite logical that they should adopt as a patron the goddess Liberty. But they gave her their own name. They called her Columbia. There's all sorts of reasons why that name came about, Columbia, but what's very interesting about the name Columbia is, even though it's supposed to be associated with Columbus, what it actually means is white dove, or dove. And the dove has been a symbol of the goddess right back into the most ancient times. So goddesses in Washington and across America as a whole have lots of different names, but ultimately they're all the same goddess. The goddess of armed freedom on the Capitol would have been called Liberty, but some of the southern senators at the time, for reasons which had to do with why the Civil War was ultimately fought, didn't like the connotation of liberty, so they called her the goddess of armed freedom instead. But her ultimate name is Columbia, and she's all over Washington, D.C.
You had mentioned Crete with the goddess there, and I know they had called her the snake goddess, and my research also has led me back to Crete, and I believe the other names there that were mentioned by historians, Greek historians, were Rhea and Cybele, and then she became Magna Mater in Rome.
Absolutely.
So this would also be the same goddess, and then also Isis of Egypt and Tiamat of the Sumerians. This is all the same goddess?
Yeah, I mean, she's often referred to as the goddess of 1,000 names. Probably the best example as far as Washington, D.C. in America is concerned is the Greek version, which was Demeter, who was the goddess of the harvest. There was a very special day which was dedicated to Demeter in the ancient world, and that was September the 17th. That was the day on which people used to go to a place called Eleusis, which is not far from Athens, and there they would go through what were known as the Demeter Mysteries. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but what we do know is that it was a ritual death and rebirth ceremony, that it was probably attended by some hallucinogenic form of drug, which may have been derived from wheat and is called ergot. But whatever it was very potent. It went on for 2,000 years, and sometimes as many as 1,500 or 2,000 people were present each time. So that was September the 17th. When we take that directly to America, we find that date occurring time and time again. For example, when the Constitution was being discussed in Philadelphia after the Revolutionary War, this Congress in Philadelphia went on for about 3 months. In fact, it went on very much longer than it needed to do. It was probably by August they decided everything they were going to decide. But Washington was the chairman of this, and he wanted the document, the Constitution, to be signed on a particular day, and that day was September the 17th. So September the 17th became enshrined in the Constitution of America, and it's now part of Constitution Week. So Constitution Week in America is exactly the same week on which the Demeter Mysteries were being held every year for 2,000 years in Greece. And at the same time, the cornerstone of the Capitol was laid on September the 16th, but they had wanted to do it on September the 17th, but there were some reasons why it couldn't be done. So again, we've got the same sort of date occurring. The very fabric of freedom and of democracy in America is based around this date, September the 17th. Incidentally, that was also the day on which Boston was founded.
Interesting on those dates. Let's get into who the goddess is. You had mentioned that she is the goddess of 1,000 names, and I know the Greeks had called her Isis Panthea, Isis the all-goddess, and she sometimes is referred to as the goddess of love and the goddess of this and so forth. And then also there's other connotations, meaning she's a dark goddess, she's the goddess of war, she's the goddess of spells and so forth. Who have you found this goddess to represent, and why is she a deity they had chosen? Yeah,
I think she is all of those things, but in the majority of cases, in terms of Washington, D.C., in terms of the whole idea of the United States of America, she is predominantly either Demeter, who is the Greek version, Isis, the Egyptian version, and Ceres, the Roman version. What she is in America at heart is a nature goddess, and particularly a goddess of the harvest. But she has other connotations as well. You find a whole series of mystery religions in the ancient world that have the same general theme, and the theme is this. There is a goddess. The goddess has sexual communion with the sky, in particular with the sun. A child is born from this union. The child then is killed, and the whole cycle goes round and round. And what this really relates to is the cutting of the corn in the autumn, hence September the 17th. And the corn god is a reoccurring symbol in just about every ancient religion, and it's right at the heart of Washington, D.C. and of America. But that's not to suggest that other aspects of the goddess don't show up as well. You find representations across Washington of Hecate, who is the god of spells and fire and all sorts of things. You find aspects of Athena, who was much more to do with regality and showiness and all the rest of it. But in the center of Washington, in the heart of Washington, the temple itself, which is the center of Washington, D.C., seems to me to be clearly identifiable with Demeter, Isis, Ceres, lots of other names, but this nature stroke harvest goddess.
You mentioned also, I believe, the arm goddess as well. And if you look at America right now, and almost since its inception, we've been involved in several wars. And then today we're in, 140 or 160 plus countries, always engaged in war. We have a lot of warriors here. Is there any connection between us being almost the world's policeman to this goddess as well?
I think the United States being the world's policeman was a very, very deliberate policy that goes back to the inception of the country. But in particular, it goes back to just before the start of the Second World War. The president at the time was Roosevelt. President Roosevelt was a 33-degree Freemason. It becomes obvious to me that he knew a great deal about all of the things I'm talking to you about now, and he seems to have known a great deal about the geometric associations of Washington, D.C. When he recognized that the war was almost inevitable because of the way Japan was behaving, and also because of what was going on in Europe at the time, he took very definite action. He decided to draw all the members of the various armed forces which were spread about Washington into one unit, and to that end the Pentagon was built. The Pentagon is a very strange structure because in terms of its measurements it might as well be a megalithic structure like Stonehenge or Avebury. It is a totally megalithic structure, but what most people don't realize about the Pentagon is it's not where it was meant to be. It was decided that the Pentagon was going to be placed a good deal further north than it is now, not far from Arlington Cemetery. But the day before the Earth was supposed to be cut, President Roosevelt got in touch with his generals and he said, I don't want it there, I want it further south, and he told them where he wanted it to be. And he also said, this is what I want it to look like. And there was a hoo-ha, to say the least, because generals like Somerville said, Mr. President, you can't do this, we've made all these arrangements, we're going to cut the first turf tomorrow. In the end, Roosevelt said to them, who is the commander-in-chief? And they said, you are, Mr. President. And he said, in that case, it will go where I want it to go, it will be what I want it to be. All of this is just so that I can tell you that when it was completed, it created its own triangle between the center of the Pentagon, the Capitol, the center of the Ellipse Park, which I told you about a few minutes ago, and then back to the Pentagon again. And if you measure that triangle, it measures 33 multiplied by 366 megalithic yards. If you look at Freemasonry, you find out that the 32nd degree of Freemasonry relates to, in the ceremony, a guy who is he's wanting to become a knight. So he has to stay in a chapel all night on his own as a vigil. This guy is called Constans, and in the ritual, which is often done as a play, and is still sometimes done as a play, all the other people present go out and leave him in this chapel on his own. Now he is tempted by 3 or 4 different people who try to draw him out for various reasons, and he won't go. Then at the end of it, he hears fighting going on outside. He knows that men are being killed and that women are being violated, and in the end, he has to break his sacred promise to stay where he is, to stay at home, and to go out and fight. Now, there's 2 different endings to this according to where the ritual is done, but the most potent ending is that Constans dies. But he dies not fighting for himself or not staying at home. He dies fighting for others. And I think that when this triangle was completed, and when Roosevelt, who was a 33-degree Freemason, had done it for the symbolism, and I think that was the time when he made the decision that America could not look to its own resources alone, because, up until the Second World War, there was a lot of isolationist thoughts in America. They didn't want to become involved in the world's wars. Well, when this triangle was created, it created 33 degrees. And the 33rd degree of Freemasonry is called the Grand Inquisitor. And that act was what made the United States the policeman of the world. It could no longer look just to its own resources. It took on a responsibility for the world. That might sound like nonsense, but I'm sure that's true.
It makes perfect sense, and especially when you look at our role in the world today and how we've evolved since that time. So,
it's greatly misunderstood, Mo.
I agree.
You know, it's greatly misunderstood because a lot of people can't look to the altruism of the United States in its attempt genuinely to make the world a better place. There'll be a lot of people listening to this who will disagree with me vehemently, but if you look across the broad spectrum of history, you know, I'm sure that's true.
If you're a studier of history, and especially alternative history and of the ancients, the last 3,000 years we have been in constant warfare and atrocities and genocide and so forth. So to make the claim that the U.S. is some evil empire out for themselves is just false. And if people research history to see where we're at today as opposed to where we were at, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, we have made leaps and bounds in our society.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it in my mind. The United States, like any nation state on the earth, has an agenda. A country doesn't survive unless it has an agenda. But it's the overall implication that's important. And the United States has not generally set out to colonize the earth. It's generally set out to try and make the earth a better place. Again, there will be listeners who will disagree with that, but that's the way I see it.
I believe it's, the checkerboard of Freemasonry, and it's just kind of this grand game, and we all get to play our roles and get to choose our role on the stage. And let's talk a little bit about Freemasonry. I just had a guest on my show a couple podcasts back who was a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Freemason who said Freemasonry was essentially a hoax and a Ponzi scheme. He said he was a member for 7 years or so. He donated a lot of his time, spent money with really nothing in return, any great learning, no esoteric kind of stuff happening. What are your thoughts on those statements he made?
Just let me tell you a little story because it's very pertinent to this. When I was last in the States last winter, I went and gave a talk to a Masonic lodge in Minnesota. And after I'd finished talking, the guy who was in charge of the talk and one of the very high-ranking Masons in Minnesota took me up to the temple where the ceremonies are held. And he showed me loads of pictures on the wall of past Grand Masters and state Grand Masters and all sorts of people who represented Scottish Rite Freemasonry in Washington, D.C. And he said, look at this guy. And he pointed one man out. He said, this guy is a great and a wonderful man. He's a 33-degree Freemason. He represents us in Washington. He's been all over the world talking about Freemasonry. But he says the one thing that this man is good at is making donuts and earning money. I said, I don't know what you mean, John. What do you mean? And he said, what I'm saying to you, Alan, is that this guy, as high-ranking as he is, knows less about the esoteric side of Freemasonry than you do. And he said, if you want to find the people who really know what's going on at Freemasonry, it isn't necessarily the most advanced ones. It's where they are. He said, I've read your books very, very well, Alan, and he said, I know that most of the decisions that were made that affected places like Washington, D.C., were made in corridors, by Freemasons who may not necessarily be particularly high-ranking, but they may have been amongst the civil service, they may have been amongst the politicians. They were the people who had clout, and they certainly did know something about what Freemasonry really represents. Now, as far as the guy you're talking about is concerned, this is a situation I've come across time and again. The man with whom I wrote so many books, Christopher Knight, started out investigating Freemasonry simply because he was a Freemason himself, and he couldn't see any point in it. There didn't seem to be any secrets, but you've got to know where to look. Just one other little story. There is a famous nursery rhyme in Britain called Oranges and Lemons, and just very briefly it goes, oranges and lemons, said the bells of St. Clemens, you owe me 4 farthings, said the bells of St. Martin's, and it goes on in that form, and it has a tune that goes with it. Now, to anybody, including most English people, the whole thing sounds like just a nonsense song, until you realize that what it represents is the sound of the bells of the churches in London, but not now. All of the churches mentioned in the nursery rhyme were destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. And the sound in the tune and the sound in the words is a representation of what those bells sounded like all those years ago. Everybody teaches their kids that nursery rhyme, but almost nobody understands that they are relating information which is 400 years old. The same is true with Freemasonry. It's not what you look at, it's how you look at it. And most aspects of Freemasonry and most symbols of Freemasonry have more skins than an onion. And so the 32-degree Freemason that you talked about was looking, but he wasn't seeing.
I've often thought that most Masons have no idea what their organization's goals and aims are, and you had said that possibly 99% of all Freemasons are totally ignorant of what lies at the very heart of their craft. Can you explain this quote?
Well, absolutely, and I think that's because there's more than one reason for everything that they do and for every symbol and for every ritual. And it's only those people who really search to look deeper that are likely to find out some of the more esoteric sides of the craft. The vast majority of Freemasons, and I'm not a Freemason myself because I think it would curtail my activities and stop me looking in the way that I do, but I've met many, many Freemasons in my career, and Freemasonry, generally speaking, makes people into better people. So there's nothing wrong with Freemasonry as it stands. It earns a great deal of money for charity. It's a social organization. I know people say that it means you favor other Freemasons, but I don't think that's any different than you would find in a golf club or in any other organization. People will help those they are associated with in any sort of group. But Freemasons do become better people, but not all of them are remotely interested in the deeper and more esoteric side of the craft. They're interested in going on a Tuesday or whenever it might be, in having a good dinner afterwards and a few drinks with their friends, and in supporting the charities and an organization which is old and venerable. And that may be as many as 99%. Actually, Mo, it probably isn't that many now, because I'm finding that a lot of younger Freemasons are showing a greater interest in the deeper side of it. So maybe that percentage is reducing gradually.
Do you feel that the esoteric side has kind of waned in the last 50 or 100 years, and that maybe we're going back towards the esoteric teachings of Freemasonry, such as, the great philosopher Manly P. Hall, who's one of my favorite writers?
Yes. There certainly is a rising interest by a specific section of Freemasons who want to know more about the older side of the craft. And Manly Hall is the kind of writer that they tend to read. On the other hand, we live in a very technological, fast-paced world. There are a lot of Freemasons who are not interested in that kind of stuff at all. But it gives them a pause from everyday life, and maybe that's useful in its own right. But I would say, from my experience, that more and more Masons are becoming interested. And I think there's a lot more books available as well, which helps, and masses of websites. I mean, most of the websites that you see on Freemasonry, by far the majority are against it, but there are some good websites if you look.
Are the Freemasons, the secret society, really in charge of Washington, D.C. and everywhere else for that matter?
Yes and no. I would prevaricate, wouldn't I? Yeah. Yes, because most of the people concerned are also Freemasons. But no, because I firmly believe that there is something else, another organization, of which parts of Freemasonry are also a part. Many people who are Freemasons in Britain, I don't know about it in America, also join things like the Rotary Club or the Lions or all sorts of other organizations. But they may also be members of the local cricket club. So lots of people belong to lots of similar sorts of organizations. I think the ultimate organization, which I cannot give a name to because it doesn't name itself, draws its resources from other places like the Freemasons. So yes, the Freemasons are part of it, but no, I don't think it's a Freemasonic plan.
Is the U.S. president really in charge, or is there this organization that you don't have a name for, the true power brokers, the powers that be?
I mean, you can answer this question on a very mundane level as well. It's always occurred to me that no leader of a country, like the Prime Minister of Great Britain or the President of America or France or Germany or anywhere, really has very much control over anything. They tend to be figureheads. Most of the decisions are made in dark corridors. I would have to say that the answer to that question is no. I don't think the American president is. There have been exceptions. There's no doubt in my mind that people like George Washington, people like Abraham Lincoln, and people especially like Roosevelt, F.D. Roosevelt, were very much in charge of what was going on around them. But that may be because they were also associated with this anonymous group that I was talking about.
You'd mentioned Lincoln, and then I also think about President Kennedy as far as doing their own thing. But when you mentioned Lincoln and then, as I had said, Kennedy, both of those men were assassinated. And I feel, as an outsider kind of looking in, I haven't studied a lot of their lives or their histories, but it looks like they were taken out for that very thing, maybe going against the power brokers and deciding to do some things on their own. And for violating that, they were assassinated. Would you say there's any truth to that?
I would say it's absolutely true, but I would also suggest at this point in our discussion that I think there are two groups of power brokers. I think there are the group who are associated with the Freemasons and with other like-minded groups whose agenda is towards one world. But there is another group of people amongst who are very high-ranking bankers, very high-ranking politicians, and very high-ranking business people who have what they would call the same agenda, but the one world that they are after is a different kind of one world. And so it's very popular for people like fundamentalists, for example, to point at what's going on and saying, Freemasons want, a one-world government where we all become the same and we have no choices anymore. It's easy for them to make that accusation, but I think there's two distinctly separate groups, one of which is ultimately selfish in its agenda, and the other which is essentially altruistic in its agenda. And I think that the people who almost certainly killed both Lincoln and Kennedy fell into the selfish group.
This world, this one world order, you see different things and conspiracies on the internet in the alternative research crowd as far as it's going to be this just big prison planet of hell for all us plebs and us citizens on the bottom as the ruling elite and the rich just pretty much pilfer from us and rule over us with a boot and pretty much have us in chains. And then my theory is that that's not the case, that this society that we live in, even though it's not perfect and there's lots that could be fixed in it, is actually almost like a heaven compared to the past societies that we've had or had to endure, and that they're just trying to possibly perfect it to where we could have, a good place to live and get rid of all the filth and the scum from this earth. And to do that would be the motto of the 33rd degree of Freemasonry, which is Ordo ab Chaos, order out of chaos. So right now, we're possibly in that chaos stage before we get to the true heaven on earth that they're working for. Would you say there's any truth to what I just said? I
really could not agree with you more. You've almost itemized what I believe. The only thing I would go on to say is that although the press and the media generally would have us believe that we live in the worst possible hell, statistics and facts don't bear that out at all. Certainly as far as the first and now the second world is concerned, people have never had it so good. We live longer, we live better, we're more educated, we can say more and do more. I was watching a program on the BBC last night which was about people's ancestors who'd fallen foul of the law in London in the Victorian era, in the 1800s. And these people were locked into an absolute cycle of poverty and crime. Now, I'm not saying, for example, that this doesn't happen anywhere, either in Great Britain or in America now. It does. But people are trying to address it. It's not as bad as it once was. And by almost every measurable standard, even though, again, a great percentage of the listeners to this will not believe it. The world is demonstrably a much better place than it was even 50 or 100 years ago.
I agree, Alan, and I want to put a little testimony out there. I have been arrested several times myself here in the United States for usually alcohol or drug-related crimes. I was an alcoholic and a drug user when I was younger, and some of these crimes that I was arrested for in the old worlds would have had me executed. I would have probably been executed 3 times over, and fortunately here in the United States that did not happen, and I was given several chances, and I thank the Lord for that. And even in other countries now, I would have been executed in China and many of the other Islamic countries. So
absolutely. I mean, in the London of Dickens, or the England of Dickens, you could be either transported for life or hanged for stealing a loaf of bread.
Jeez. And I know they cut your hand off in other countries, and you get caught with a joint in China, you're going to get your head blown off. So absolutely. But this is not popular. I don't know why, but it's not popular to say these things. For some reason, which I don't really quite understand, we seem to have a vested interest of believing that the world is a thoroughly awful place. An American lady of my knowing, who was over here to do some filming with me for the History Channel just last week, was in London with her son, and she was mugged by some Romanian guy or other, and the locals who were round about chased this guy. One of them broke this guy's nose. He was taken into custody, and when I said to the lady in question, how sorry I was that this had happened to her in my country, she said, "Alan, I could not have been treated better." You know, she said, everybody was out for me. Everybody was looking out for me. She said, the police were fantastic. And I found exactly the same thing in the United States. Touch wood, I've never had a bad experience in the United States, and I've never found anybody there anything other than absolutely accommodating and friendly. So I'm not altogether sure whether a lot of the publicity that we subject to is necessarily representative of what's actually happening. I totally agree with you, Alan, and we need to look at the world as the glass is half full as opposed to being half empty sometimes.
Yes, and that's very true, Mo, and if we believe that, it will get fuller still.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the old power brokers that were in the old world that seem to be taking the stage again, and they would be centered in Rome and the Vatican and the Catholic Church. To everybody who has studied history knows that they were the major rulers and powers in the world for many centuries. What role do they have in this? Is there any connection with the Vatican and Freemasonry in Washington, D.C. at all?
I don't think there is.
Okay.
I think that the Catholic Church is fighting like fury at the moment because it's losing ground rapidly. It doesn't have the hold over its followers in the West, especially, as much as it once did. I'm not saying that there never has been a connection between the Vatican and Freemasonry. I'm sure that there has, though it's still a case that you can be excommunicated from the Catholic Church simply by becoming a Freemason. There may be dark periods, there may be dark happenings. We were talking, for example, about the Jesuits. I'm not sure what the Jesuits are really all about, but neither can I believe in my own mind that the Vatican really has much power at all anymore. But as in everything else I'm saying to you, Mo, I could be wrong.
Are we on the threshold of a new world order, and is there a powerful cartel of extremely influential people who have been and are trying to create a one world government? Is this the power brokers behind the scenes you've talked about?
I think we have to be very, very careful because, as I said earlier, it's my belief that there are two organizations that are trying to steer us towards the kind of world that they want. One of the organizations contains a lot of civil servants, a lot of high-ranking business people, a lot of politicians, but it's difficult to tell who's who sometimes. Those people seem to want to keep us down, to keep us the way we once were, so that they can be better off, so that they can lord it over us. I don't see that in the second group. I don't see that in the group which includes so many Freemasons. I'm not saying that there is no crossover, because I'm sure that there is. But I am content in my mind, after having researched and written all these books, that the kind of New World Order which I've been looking at is never intended to belittle people or to make people poorer or to make people more wretched. On the contrary, it does the exact opposite. And those people who would, for example, criticize the Freemasons probably know very little about how much money is raised every year by Freemasons across the world. And it doesn't go solely to Freemasonic charities. On the contrary, the vast majority of it goes to places that we never hear about, other countries and other people. So beneath the surface, quietly, steadily, these people are gaining influence. And that's how it seems to me. But maybe I'm just naive.
If you look at these two groups that you mentioned, if we were to have, say, some of these corporations and these billionaires ruling over us that are at the same time selling plastic goods, poisoning the earth, poisoning people, destroying our Mother Earth, if we go down that route, it doesn't take a scientist or some rocket scientist to tell me that we're going to destroy ourselves if we continue down that path. And the best way to save our world and to save maybe this power structure they already have built, you know, and I often say that the pyramid's built, it's time to start dismantling some of the bullshit and the poisons from the world, that there could be some type of happy medium where whoever these power brokers are, they can maintain, of course, some of their wealth and their power, but at the same time, we can create more of a heaven on earth where we're not destroying it, we're not poisoning it, we're not poisoning the air and the waters and so forth. Can there be a happy medium between these two groups, possibly?
Well, we've never met before, Mo, but we clearly speak the same language, and I'm convinced that there can be, and that gradually there is being. The only difference is that the people with the big companies, the people who are manipulating us and who are damaging the earth, are very noisy. The other people tend to be much quieter. They've been here for a very, very long time. They're extremely patient, but they are getting there.
Do you have any advice for the people out there in regards to finding, you know, hidden secrets and symbols? You've done a great job of it yourself. What would you suggest to those people out there that are maybe just starting to research alternative history? How can they find their own piece of truth?
There is only one piece of advice that stands out above all others, and that is how Freemasons describe their own secrets, and that is the expression hidden in plain sight. The important thing is to look at any piece of research that you think might hide something underneath it and try to look at it from a different perspective. Freemasonry is the best case in question. If you read through any particular Freemasonic ritual, like the third degree ritual, for example, which makes a man or a woman into a fully fledged Freemason, it sounds like so much mumbo-jumbo, to be quite honest. It's only when you start to take it apart piece by piece that you begin to understand what's really going on below the surface. I think it's the same for all searchers. I think another piece of advice is don't be taken in just because something seems to be magical or mysterious, because a great deal of what you and I have been talking about is not magic or mysterious at all if you know what you're looking for. It's to do with what we've been talking about with Washington, D.C. You need to walk down the mall with different eyes. You need to know what's happening to you personally, as happened to you when you were in Washington, D.C., to know that you're in a place which has been held as deeply sacred to a lot of people. Just using what they call the third eye, you know, just opening your mind, not being gullible, not being taken in, and doing an awful lot of historical research.
Couple quick questions I forgot to ask you in regards to the goddess before we go today, Alan. One would be, are the Freemasons essentially the priests of the goddess?
That's another question which can only be answered with yes and no. Those who really understand, those who really know, most definitely are. The vast majority are not. But if you look at an army, for example, you know, only some of the real high-ranking generals know what's really going on.
Of course.
And I think that's also true to a great extent in Freemasonry. So, without wishing to prevaricate, the vast majority don't even know about the goddess. Yeah. But there are some people there, and people I've met specifically in the United States who are very, very powerful, who will tell me all sorts of things behind closed doors, but won't repeat those things in any kind of public situation, and swear me to secrecy about them. And I've heard enough to know what's really going on.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It only is common sense that in any organization, even my own company, I own my own small business, that I don't tell my employees or people that I hire by my goals or my aims of the company any secrets that are going on between my business partner, who happens to be my wife. So that's just natural that any organization, any company, any country, that there's going to be people even at the high levels that don't understand the true goals and aims of the organization.
Absolutely, and it's total common sense, really, isn't it? Because if you shared every aspect of your business with your employees, the thing just wouldn't work.
Correct. The last question I have for you in regards to the goddess, why have they chose the goddess pretty much to be the ruler of this earth, when before, of course, you had mentioned gods, there was Osiris, there was various gods who I believe represented the planet Jupiter, and then we have the goddess coming in to seem like she is going to be the queen of Earth for here in eternity. Even in the comics, I forget who it is, I believe it was Thor, they just announced that Thor is going to be a woman in the next episode. And
really?
From now on. So to me, this almost, it's like a sign that they're telling us, hey, the goddess is here to stay. She won.
Yeah, I think an interesting point about that is that, judging by the little statues and the votive offerings that we've found all across Europe and Asia, which date back to prehistory, the goddess as a central figure in religion seems to have been on the go and to have perpetrated probably for 20 or 30,000 years or more. The period during which she has been replaced by very powerful and very, very aggressive masculine deities has only been for the last 3,000 years. So it's a drop in the ocean. And maybe what we can see is that we've been through a hiccup, Okay, so it was a long hiccup from the point of view of one human life, but in terms of history as a whole, it was a very short period of time. Also, people are starting to realize that, at essence, the Earth is all we have. If we don't look after the Earth can't be expected to look after us. And since the Earth produces, since the Earth is fertile, it's only natural to assume that the Earth is a female presence. And, even now, even in these days of absolute equality, women have more sense than men. It's something that's difficult for me to admit in a public venue, but it's true, Mo.
Yeah, and of course there's always exceptions to that rule, but I do agree with you there, Alan. I'm married to a wonderful woman who happens to have the name Agricola, which actually means agriculture. And it's interesting. Yeah, and my daughter, I didn't know it, I named her Kiana, and that's related to Diana and the goddess as well. So it's interesting how I inadvertently had married a goddess of the earth and also named my daughter after a goddess. So it's interesting.
Do you have any idea how your wife came to be named Agricola?
She's actually named after her grandmother, who's 92 years old, and they're from Mexico. So
one of these days we must talk again, okay. And we must talk specifically about an American organization called The Grange, which is a farming organization. It doesn't sound as if it would be particularly interesting to your listeners, but I can guarantee you would be absolutely mesmerized if you knew what had been going on in the United States since just after the American Civil War.
No, I'd love to talk to you, Alan. It's obvious that we have a lot of the similar views, and I know you have a lot of other books and subjects you write about, so I'd love to talk to you again in the next few months or 6 months, if that's possible.
Yeah, no problem at all. Anytime, Mo. It's been like talking to an old friend.
I agree. And before we wrap up the show today, can you tell the audience where is the best place they can find the City of the Goddess, your book, and your great work? I know you have several websites. Just point them the best direction.
Okay. Well, if they actually want the books themselves, they can get any of them on Amazon, either Amazon UK or Amazon.com. I do have websites for for most of my books, and I think, will you be putting my websites up?
Yeah, I'll put on my website, Gnostic Warrior, I'll put a link to your websites and, of course, to Amazon.
And I try to make the websites as comprehensive as I can. A lot of authors tend to use websites as kind of like an advertising for the books. Of course, I'm not so stupid as to believe that I wouldn't like all your listeners to buy my books, but still, they'll find a great deal of information on the websites, and they're probably worth a look. They'll find a few strange websites there as well that we haven't talked about.
Definitely, and I did go to your website, City the Goddess, and you pretty much have it almost all there if people want to look through it. But, I love to have a book in hand, and I had ordered your book, and I'm going to get that from Amazon, and I think it'll be...
Obviously, the book always goes deeper into it than you possibly could on a website, but I try to give as much information as I can, and I'm always interested to hear from people who've read the website or the books, and there's addresses there where they can get in touch with me.
Great. Alan, it has been an awesome pleasure speaking with you today, and thank you for coming on the Gnostic Warrior radio show and podcast.
Mo, it's been the greatest pleasure. I'll be back any time. Just keep the coffee pot on.
Definitely. I wish you the best. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.